organizational strength, moral, economic.
Hey, Composite Gloves here, and this is another video on the anatomy of the ear. I'm going to try and wrap up most of the stuff that we need to concern ourselves with in this video. We're going to be talking about the inner ear, which I probably have at some point accidentally called the middle ear, or I've confused the two. But anyways, just so you know, we're talking about the inner ear, which is the cochlea for the most part. But the cochlea is one complicated dude. There's a whole bunch of other parts, but at this point you could really split into a lot of directions. So we're going the psychoacoustic direction. So we're just going to look at a few things that have to do with psychoacoustics. We're also going to be explaining why your hearing is from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So let's head on over. Now, we're not getting to the brain quite yet. Brain's like another deal. In fact, it's a huge deal. But honestly, if you understand this, you don't need to concern yourself too much with the brain. We'll be talking about when the brain becomes important, we'll talk about it. So if I come over here, boom, I have here here's our ear. And so we know that sound gets amplified here because it has to move this liquid that's in this thing called the cochlea. Now, the cochlea, if you were to take this snail-like thing and line it all out, it's actually easier to understand. Basically what the cochlea has in it is it's got a bunch of liquid with various membranes, and then what happens is the stapes, this guy right here, hits something called the oval window, causing the liquid in it to move. Now this liquid needs room to move. It's like a little sack sort of. So it's got this little thing called the round window down here that allows it to push and pull, so you have a little more movement. Anyways, that's why it has to amplify. It's got to move this liquid. Now, and when it moves this liquid, there's all these little hairs inside, and each hair sort of resonates depending on how this liquid moves. It's like this crazy acoustic. It starts off as acoustic energy. It gets translated eventually into neural or electrical energy via your cochlea. But what happens is this liquid moves around, and depending on how the liquid moves, the frequencies will correlate with a spot on this thing called the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane has this thing running right underneath it, or right next to it, however you want to look at it. It's kind of weird. Anyways, basilar membrane. Then you have this thing called the organ of Corti. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's a thing, and it goes underneath as far as the basilar membrane goes down. Remember, we're looking at it as like a tube, but it's actually all spiraled up like it is right here. And inside there's a bunch of little hairs. There's different types of hairs. And so we're going to talk about that. Now, let's get to this first. So the cochlea, as we just discussed, the stapes hits the thing, making the liquid move. It hits the oval window, causing liquid to move. I just like doing this so much. You'll punch someone. So anyways, we have these various ducts. There's various additional membranes. The ones we are going to concern ourselves with, because we're looking at this from a hearing perspective, not as like some sort of ear doctor perspective. We're looking at this. Oh, by the way, I'm wearing a hat. We're looking at the basilar membrane. So here's the basilar membrane. It's this guy right here, and he runs all the way down this duct in your cochlea, which of course is actually turning. I believe it's 2.5 times it turns around the center, and there's like a fancy word that starts with M that describes that, but I forgot what it was. And then as you can see right underneath or next to, or however you want to look at it, you will see there's something called the organ of Corti. So that's what goes on. So liquid is moving around in here, and it moves the basilar membrane, and there are different hairs that, okay, so the basilar membrane moves, and of course different frequencies will cause the stapes to hit the oval window differently, which will cause the basilar membrane to move differently. Okay, so once you have that, so there's the reason it's 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz is because the basilar membrane is actually, I believe it's stiffer at the front and much more fluid at the back, and there are hairs in this thing called the organ of Corti. So this guy moves, and if it's a high frequency, it's gonna move this first part of the basilar membrane. And the hairs in the organ of Corti at the beginning part of the basilar membrane, it's actually it's narrow, and then it widens out. And it also, the hairs in the organ of Corti are actually smaller. They're itsy bitsy. And then as you go down the organ of Corti, it gets bigger. It takes more energy to move because the liquid has to go farther. And the hairs in the organ of Corti get much longer, which kind of makes sense. A bigger frequency, bigger hairs to pick up that frequency. So anyways, you'll notice that you won't notice, but it's just so you know, girls can sometimes hear, I mean, there are obviously exceptions on both sides of the spectrum, but girls typically can hear higher frequencies because their they have smaller basilar membranes, like smaller ears. So they have a tinier basilar membrane at the entrance. So it's a small thing. There are guys that sometimes have bigger, ears. It's technically it's up to you, but people like generalizations like that. So anyways, if now let's take a piece of that organ of Corti and sort of look at it. So as you can see, this is a piece of the organ of Corti. And as you can see, there's all these membranes and blah, 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 blah. It's like kind of crazy. And just so you know, the cochlea is bony. It's actually it's like bone. But I believe it's not as hard as bone. I don't know. I was reading this whole thing talking about exactly how the cochlea was different from a regular bone, but that's completely irrelevant. I don't even know why I'm bringing it up. I was reading all manner of unusual things, and I learned a lot about hearing diseases too. So anyways, the basilar membrane, as you can see, is right here. And so, what is that? Right here, basilar membrane. Whoop, right there. As you can see, as the liquid moves the basilar membrane, so some liquid comes in and it's moving around. And let's say on the basilar membrane that there's different frequencies. So like up here's like our 20 kilohertz and down here's our 20. So let's just say it hits like our 500 hertz range. So 500 hertz range. And so it's moving. By the way, that's why our hearing is what it is. So it's moving, and it moves this thing called the tectorial membrane. So here's the tectorial membrane. It's this thing right here. As it moves this thing. So, okay, so we got some sort of parallel motion going on. And as you see, there's all these little hairs right there. Just little hairs. And there are different kinds. There's something called the outer hairs and the inner hairs, and they're actually right there. And what is these hairs' jobs? Well, these hairs take that energy, and what happens is your tectorial membrane is actually charged. It's ionized, and your outer hair cells are also ionized, and they are attached to your cranial. It's not labeled. I don't see it here anyways. They are attached to your cranial membrane. So your hairs, what happens is they're holding a charge. This guy's holding a charge. When they rub together, it's called deionization. It causes the hair to send out a charge that runs down here and says, brain, this person is hearing a thing. And then your brain gets involved, and it goes in all sorts of directions. Honestly, it's pretty interesting. You should just look up some books and read about the books. But anyways, that's what's going on. So the more of these firings go off, so the more the liquid moves and that particular liquid resonates, so the moving of the basilar membrane resonates with that frequency, will cause these hairs, which of course are different lengths depending on where they appear on the basilar membrane. So these hairs are the length that is appropriate for 500 hertz. And as the basilar membrane moves, it causes this thing, the tectorial membrane, to move, which moves these hairs. And these are inner hairs that send the neural firing. So they get the neural firing gets sent off, and they get sent down, and these guys can only fire, I believe they can only fire 1,000 times a second. Maybe it's 100 times. No, I think it's 100, not 1,000. As you can see, I'm very well versed in this. So if any of you know like the technical details, you can, but what ends up happening is if it gets louder, like if you need to receive something that's really loud, they can't fire off enough times to tell you that it's loud, like that loud. So what do? They take turns. Another really interesting thing is you can, they're phase locked for the most part. Like they're not perfect, but if a wave cycle is peaking, like you have like 100 hertz and it peaks and then it goes down, peaks again, compression, refraction. Of course, this up down thing is sort of misleading because that's not how sound is. It sounds like a bubble sort of. So it actually will fire at the peak positive, so the max compression when it's most compressed, and the most rarefied. That's a word. So anyways, it's really interesting. Now, they don't do it every single time, but for the most part, they fire off then. So your hearing is kind of phase locked. So you can detect phase more or less. So it's kind of a cool deal. So that fires off into the brain. Now we have this other thing. So those are inner hair cells. And that should explain how you perceive loudness. Also should explain why you don't want to mess these guys up. If you want to hear stuff, frequency and loudness, you need these guys intact. And introducing really strong, loud vibrations, like really loud volume into your ear, is going to cause your basilar membrane to move a lot, which is going to cause your tectorial membrane to move a lot, which is going to cause it to just rip or damage. It's going to push the hair cells straight. They're not going to work anymore. It's going to damage your hair cells because of the extreme amount of movement, which will, and just so you know, you can't grow these back. So once they're gone, they're friggin' gone. So you don't want to do this. So, okay, let's talk about inner hair cells. Inner hair cells are actually an evolutionary type deal. I was reading about it. It's kind of interesting. And what it is it's also one of the reasons why you can hear stuff as soft as you can. They like sit there and they're not attached to a membrane. What they are is they're sort of like an amplifier. Well, they are an amplifier. They like, you get a picture of their hair cells there. I caught a video of it. If you go on like Wikipedia, they have, if you do enough digging, you'll come across a video of it. It's really interesting. And don't ask me to go find it again, because that's one of those weird things you just found doing research. I'm like, oh, well, that's pretty cool. So anyways, these tiny air cells don't move. They'll flex like this. And when a sound comes in, and they'll do it to amplify that vibration. It's a little more complicated than that. But anyways, they move around and they cause it to be amplified. So you can hear stuff that's outrageously soft. Like, think about it. I want you to get as quiet as possible. And then I just want you to take your hand way out here and move your fingers up and down just like that. You will hear it. That's freaking crazy that you can hear that soft. So that's one of the reasons you can hear things that soft is that right there. So a lot of people in records were all about this compress the living crap out of our mixes. We make everything as loud as possible, blah, 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 blah. When I used to be a classical music buff, and I've been listening to a lot recently. One of the beautiful things about it is they take advantage of that. If you've ever been in a band, at least a classical, and you've ever had a private instructor, man, they scream dynamics down your throat. They're like, be freaking softer here and be louder over here. Like, use your dynamic range. And that's one of the things that a lot of modern music simply doesn't use this as far as pop is concerned. Pop just simply is loud all the time. It's called the loudness wars. And so it has to do a lot of them with them trying to take advantage of what's going on here. So besides the fact that we're mechanically limited, we also have this neuron thing going on too. It's kind of an interesting deal. And there's other things. But anyways, those amplify, it gets sent down, and the eighth cranial membrane makes several stops around the brain. While we're talking about the brain, your brain is a parallel processor. It's not a serial processor. So it just does everything at the same time, and it's freaking crazy. And so I'll have a brief video about what I've read and what I've learned, but it's not super duper important because all the psychoacoustic phenomena that now it is mega important, and they're answering questions though that are really hard for me to. I just simply need to know more if I'm gonna even approach these questions. But like, why do you like the music you like, and why don't they like the music, and why are these sounds cool for all humans but not for like monkeys, and why there's like all these weird questions that are getting answered. How do we tell if a musical statement is joke-like or a fun musical statement, while one is a serious or deep or depressing musical statement? You know, there's all these things that are being studied pretty intensively now. So it's kind of an interesting deal. There was a sentence I said right before I was going to get into that, something not about the brain. Was it about the brain? I don't remember. But anyways, that more or less is why you hear the frequency range. It's just because you have this thing called the basilar membrane. It's only so long, and the hairs there's only so many. That's also a huge deal on why people are like, be careful how you listen, wear earplugs to concerts, all those types of things. If you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe and have a blessed day. Here it is.